Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Wilson Center's Global Europe Program event examining the Transatlantic Blue Economy, an exciting new publication that will be released early next week, where we pull together some of the leading thinkers on these issues from the United States and from Europe. We're delighted to have a number of the authors with us today. Before we get going, though, I'd very much like to thank the generous support of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and in particular, Paul Linnertz in their Washington office. A quick shout out to Lars Hensel over in Berlin. We're delighted to partner with the Adenauer Stiftung for quite a while now, and we're looking to expand that collaboration. This is an issue that matters a great deal to us at the Wilson Center. It's an issue where there is still a great deal of ignorance, I have to say, out there in the world. And so what these chapters that we've managed to pull together from these absolutely excellent authors, what they do is they help us to give a much more complete idea of what is included within the blue economy, the challenges that are there, and really a lot of the opportunities and policy options that are available to folks on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So we have a pretty packed program here today. So let me begin by turning over to the first of our authors, Michael Conathan, who is the Senior Policy Fellow for Ocean and Climate at Aspen. Mike, I wonder if we could ask you to run through your chapter in this new publication. Tell us sort of what the main takeaways are for you, any policy recommendations you may have in there. And then we're going to save all of the questions to the Q&A session for everybody, which will come in about 40 minutes time. Mike, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Duncan. Thanks to the Wilson Center team for putting this together and for including my work in your compilation, and for reaching out to make that connection. As Duncan mentioned, I am a Senior Policy Fellow at the Aspen Institute. Also formerly, just as a bit of background, I created an ocean policy program at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., really focused on blue economy development and particularly the policy interface in the U.S. federal government. And I also serve on the advisory board for Jason Scorse's group at the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. So hear more about his work, I'm sure, here in a few minutes. And I live and work now in Portland, Maine, and I've been up here in New England for about the last 8 years. And so for me, the topic that I chose to focus on for this work was on ocean cluster development and blue tech cluster development. And partly that's because I am a member of the New England Ocean Cluster up here. And I've been able to see firsthand the value of what these organizations bring to the blue economy in general and what the potential is there. And I've done some work with the Ocean Foundation and a couple of other organizations around promoting this growing model of blue economy development, which really has significant roots in this transatlantic scenario. So it was really sort of an ideal crossover point for some of the work that I've done and the work that you're putting together here at Wilson as well. So that was really the focus of my paper here, is on promoting this growing transatlantic ocean cluster model. So to start with, it seems most useful, I suppose, to think about, okay, what the hell is an ocean cluster? Like, what even is that? And so the first step is, defining what that means. Cluster models are something that have taken root in economics in general. It's a theory that was sort of first put together or primarily promoted by Michael Porter, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, who defines them a cluster as a geographic concentration of interconnected companies and institutions in a particular field. So when we talk about ocean clusters and blue tech clusters, really it's about bringing that blue economy work into everything that a cluster organization can represent. And so again, for clarity, because blue economy itself is a definition that isn't fully realized, and everybody sort of has a slightly different perspective on what the blue economy actually is, I thought it useful to kind of kick off that when I talk about the blue economy, it's always with an inclusion of an inherent element of sustainability. That to me is the blue in the blue economy, which differentiates it from the ocean economy. This is the World Bank definition, where they talk about the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods and jobs, while preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem, which is a really critical component that can get lost in some other definitions. So I wanted to be clear up front that that's what I'm talking about when I say the blue economy. So in the ocean field, the clusters that we're talking about are really those that focus on innovation, research, and business development in ocean-related industries that bring together stakeholders from across this triple helix comprised of academia and education, business and industry, and government and policymakers to serve as hubs of innovation for development. And they take lots of different forms. Some of them have physical infrastructure, some of them do not. Some of them have, they do focus on blue economy and include that sustainability focus, others do not. Some organizations that describe themselves as ocean and blue tech clusters actually branch out beyond just the saltwater ecosystems into all activities related to water, and their blue is defined as all water. And so, there are lots of different iterations of what these entities mean, and there is no sort of single accepted definition. But what they do all share, regardless of that organizational structure, is subject matter focus, a membership component, and a desire to innovate, and the recognition that there is great opportunity in co-location and collaboration. So whether or not there's an actual office space or a shared workplace, there is still a network of collaboration that exists within the auspices of this cluster definition. So ocean clusters in general first really emerged in Western Europe, primarily Scandinavia and into the Mediterranean, primarily with different sort of government-sponsored models, particularly in Norway, and then down in Southern Europe in France, Spain, and Portugal, where you were getting some recognition from government that these types of organizations, cluster organizations, were a critical way to bring people together, to create relationships, to foster innovation and entrepreneurship, and that was worthy of some fundamental government support. So you started to see some of these things emerge, as I say, in Scandinavia primarily, and in the Mediterranean. And this has sort of taken off over the last decade or so, to the point where, I referenced one example in the paper, that the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, have come together and actually created, in 2019, they released a Nordic vision document and put a lot of effort into thinking about, all right, how are we as the Nordic countries of the world going to collaborate on, they created 8 pillars of innovation and entrepreneurship. So to take advantage of the shared opportunity in their geographic locations, in their proximity, and the shared sort of goals and values of folks who are operating across their geographic network. One of those 8 pillars is blue economy, and is the economic growth factor that can come from development and innovation in the blue economy sector. In the US, these models have also emerged more so over the last, really over the last 5 to 7 years, started to see them take root and take off. Obviously in coastal regions, we see them in Pacific Coast. There's the Alaska Ocean Cluster. Maritime Blue is an organization that is launched in the Seattle area, founded initially out of the Washington State Department of Commerce, and has developed quite a track record there as well. There's an organization called the Maritime Alliance down in San Diego that has operated for quite some time. That being an example of one that really focuses on all water and doesn't limit its scope to the sustainability-minded industries and innovations. So it's a slightly different model there. And TMA has formed the Blue Tech Cluster Alliance with some partners in Europe. And so they have a collaborative that they've developed and cultivated through that organization. One on the Gulf Coast, University of Southern Mississippi, which has brought that ecosystem in. And then recently here in New England and in the Northeast, we've seen quite a few of these organizations pop up. New England Ocean Cluster that I'm a part of launched in 2016, opened our physical workspace, very auspicious date of March 18th, 2020, which made it not much of a physical workspace for about the first 6 months or so of operations. But despite that, we managed to claw our way out of that pandemic challenge, and has thriving and nearly full capacity office space here in Portland, Maine. Also cropping up in Southern New England, New Bedford, Providence area, and now more recently in Long Island as well. So lots of different models popping up. And then there are other models as well that are more in the sort of accelerator mode. So these are in places like Sustainable Ocean Alliance, founded in San Francisco, or Sea Ahead in Boston, that are really about less of that workspace collaboration, but more about seeding and funding and creating opportunity for innovators to grow their business. I focused in the paper a little bit specifically on one connection, which is between Iceland and our New England Ocean cluster in Portland. And the key component here is the relationships that have grown between these two cities and these two entities in particular. Iceland and Portland have had a relationship as two cities, primarily based on the establishment of the headquarters for Eimskip, which is the Iceland shipping company. Their North American headquarters is now established in Portland, Maine. And so based on that relationship and growing relationships as they opened the Iceland Ocean cluster in 2012, there's really been a direct link between our two organizations. And in fact, the New England Ocean cluster is almost an offshoot of the Iceland Ocean cluster in that sense, philosophically, as well as in the approaches that we take to our collaborations. And I wanted to highlight two key programs that have taken off in the last few years. The first is an academic exchange, which is fundamentally based on seeding the blue economy with the next generation of leaders and innovators, internship programs for graduate and undergraduate students from both Iceland and Maine to cross over and collaborate with the other. This has been ongoing for about the last 5 years, and annual gatherings at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, which I just came back from a couple of months ago, my first international post-COVID experience, which was incredible to see the innovations that are taking place there. And that network is now expanding to include Greenland and Sweden and some other Northeast regional university locations. And then secondly, the business development network that comes out of this. And just to highlight a couple of examples, in 2019, Maine and Iceland collaborated. The sort of the centerpiece was the Maine beer box, where we sent over a shipping container on an Eimskip vessel with about 75 taps for individual Maine microbrews over to Iceland. Preceding that, business leaders had gone on a 10-day bike trip organized by the Iceland and New England Ocean clusters around Iceland to coordinate, develop these relationships. Everybody came back to Iceland. There was a big party with the beer box. Relationships got built. Foundational principles got created. Coming out of that, concrete examples. LL Bean has figured out a pathway to open their first European retail location. So not exactly a maritime use there, but a clear linkage coming out of that relationship. And then we're working closely with the Iceland Ocean Cluster on their 100% fish project. So spawning partnerships across aquaculture, marine biotech, seafood processing, to figure out how to use more of the waste products that come out of the fishing industry in the biological waste products. I know we'll hear a little more about the gear waste products coming up from Nicole and Sarah. But really figuring out, what do we do with the parts of the fish that aren't food? And in Iceland, they've made some incredible innovations there. There's now a partnership developing between an Icelandic company and a Maine company to figure out what to do with lobster waste. What can we do with all these lobster shells that we come up with in Maine? Using Eimskip as a physical logistical mover of those products back and forth. There are now innovations that are coming out of that, and companies developing all over the place in that regard. So coming out of that, a couple of quick recommendations for policymakers. First of all, continue to prioritize funding for these organizations, as was done in Scandinavia and in Southern Europe. We've seen a couple of investments from the United States Department of Commerce, the Economic Development Agency, and NOAA in blue economy into some of the ocean clusters. So to continue and elevate that work. Establish some benchmarking statistical analyses to track cluster development and their contributions to the economy, as well as the blue economy writ large, general tracking mechanisms for what is the blue economy, establish these definitions, establish what's coming out of it. And finally, increasing investment in ocean observation and monitoring, which will provide both opportunities for innovators to tap into that space, as well as an opportunity to track progress and how our ocean is doing, and all the economic and affiliated environmental benefits that will come with that. So final thought, clusters are really about partnerships, relationships, and triple bottom line solutions, this combination of people, planet, and profit. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity, and just really excited to be a part of it here at New England. So thanks, Duncan. Thanks to Wilson Center, and looking forward to hearing from others.
Thanks a lot, Mike. My big takeaway from reading your paper is that partnerships are really about beer, but I'm in, so include me on the next one. Thank you very
Maine's
much
a great
for that.
place for it.
Let me just send a quick message to the audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them to our Twitter account at Wilson Center GEP, or alternatively to our email, gep@wilsoncenter.org. That's GEP for Global Europe Program. We're going to move on right now to the next presentation from Jason Skorse, Director for the Center for the Blue Economy. I'm delighted that you were able to be with us, despite the fact that you're swimming in a tank with whales. I hope we can hear your audio clearly, Jason.
Indeed. Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Wilson Center, for having me. So I'm going to talk about the new blue economy seafood sector. And just as a prelude, I want to build off one point Mike said, which is that the blue economy is a subset of the ocean economy. Some people use them synonymously. They are not synonymous. I want that to be emphatic about that. The ocean economy includes tons of destructive and unsustainable practices, including, offshore oil and gas and deep seabed mining and all kinds of stuff that are not blue economy sectors. So the blue economy is this narrower subset of sustainable and or regenerative ocean sectors. With that being said, I work in the marine policy space, and I've been working in here about 15 years, and most of the organizations, whether it's NGOs, governments, even most private sector, are focused on trying to make industrial and or small scale fisheries more sustainable. This is necessary work, but my point here is it's wholly insufficient to the task. So commercial industrial fishing will never be truly sustainable. There are no ways to deal with the huge bycatch issues, the huge overcatch issues, the scientific requirements to manage some of these highly pelagic species in the ways that are truly sustainable are not going to happen with 8 to 10 billion people with high incomes demanding seafood. So while I applaud the efforts at making industrial fishing more sustainable, it's, again, absolutely necessary, it's wholly insufficient. So what we need is a new blue economy seafood sector that really focuses on food system sustainability relative to ocean resources. And that's what I want to talk about today. And so there's 3 dimensions to this. One is old, and that is sustainable aquaculture. And it's been around for thousands of years. Most modern aquaculture does not fit that definition because, again, it's in the more industrial, high concentration industries. But there are some promising new industries developing. Most of these are low trophic level species. So it's sea vegetables, it's various forms of kelp, shellfish, and then all types of processes in addition to food can be created from these. There's great carbon sequestration potential. There's great biodiversity potential, water quality potential. There's even a lot of new evidence coming out that this can mitigate local ocean acidification effects if it's done well. I don't want to make the assumption here that all large scale shellfish and kelp aquaculture can be sustainable, but many of it can, and I think there's some really great work going on here. There is also, if you all haven't seen the TED Talk, Dan Barbara of the Veta La Palma aquaculture facility in southern Spain, I highly recommend checking that out. And that's a really fascinating, it's a land-based system, but it's with seawater. It's kind of an estuary system where they have this really incredibly managed ecosystem, and they harvest fish from there, and it has no inputs at all. It's literally, the health of the ecosystem generates the fish, and it's not an industrial facility. It's kind of a conservation / aquaculture facility, and it's just incredibly, dynamic and promising. So that's one element. The next 2 elements are ones you might not have heard of very much. And the first is cultivated seafood. And cultivated seafood is the cell-based agriculture. So you've probably heard about growing meat in labs and industrial facilities. Well, they're doing that now with fish and other types of seafood. 2 companies that I want to draw your attention to are Finless Foods and Blue Nalu. They are growing in kind of industrial facilities, bluefin tuna. And Finless Foods, I know, plans to introduce it at market prices next year. So this is identical tuna to bluefin, grown on land in industrial facilities, cleaner probably than what's out in the ocean, since there's not going to be mercury and microplastics in it, and it's going to be cost competitive. This, to me, the cultivated seafood industry is the most promising. The reason I would still call it blue economy is it's using the genetic resources from the ocean. A lot of the feed that's used to grow the medium is actually can become from the ocean, sea vegetables, et cetera, to get those omegas into the fish. And again, we're talking about identical product. We're talking about things that you would not be able to tell was not bluefin tuna caught in the sea, because it is literally bluefin tuna. It is not a substitute of bluefin tuna. This promise, not just for sea, but also to get rid of factory farming and, for livestock, this is the most promising industry, in my view, in the world. And I think should be really, really considered a kind of foundational element of the blue economy. Obviously, the technology is in its infancy. There's huge R&D requirements. There's huge scale requirements. It's not a coincidence they're starting with bluefin tuna because the market price is so expensive that they can be cost competitive, right? They're not doing, cod and snapper because right now the technology can't produce that at scale that's cost competitive. But the way I like to think about this is that this industry is where solar was 20 years ago. And if you look at predictions of solar costs 20 years ago, they didn't think they would be as cheap as they are today. So I want to make the claim that I think with the proper R&D and investment, in 20 years, we could have technologies that produce huge quantities of identical or cleaner seafood than what's produced in the ocean, completely removing all of that pressure from industrial fishing and also just complementing artisanal fisheries. It's not necessarily a replacement, although I would like to see it replace the most destructive of commercial fisheries. The final point I want to make here is plant-based alternatives. And some of you might have tried some of these. Some of these have been around for quite a long time. They're actually getting pretty sophisticated. And also, lo and behold, it turns out that something like a crab cake, which is some crab with breading that's fried with lots of sauce, you don't really need real crab to make it taste like that. A lot of the things that people eat as fish are not really that much fish product, and a plant-based alternative with kelp and algae can taste almost identical to it right now, and it's cost competitive. And so the recommendations I just want to make that are related to these policies are governments really need to get involved. Singapore, Israel, big on this. The US just gave a $10 million grant from the USDA to start an Institute of Cellular Agriculture. So this is a hugely positive sign, especially coming from the USDA. There's regulations now going to kind of create an even playing field and have these products quickly come to market. And again, but the plant-based stuff also uses ocean materials. So I do consider this, blue economy. And so I'll just end here by saying, I think this stuff is incredibly promising. I think we could, if this gets the right investment, if the NGO community, if the public sector, if private VC, venture capital invests at scale, we could see these go the way of solar. And in 20 years, have industries that are producing, for mass consumption products with ocean resources that taste and nutritionally are identical, but without the huge negative externalities that we all know too well, as some of our next speakers will speak to. So thanks again for the opportunity. I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Jason. And let me just say that in this publication, which will be released next week, we include a large number of links. So the video that Jason mentioned, there's a link to that in the publication. I had a lot of fun watching that as well. It's a good way for us to point our viewers to other resources beyond just this publication. We're next going to turn to Justin Sternberg, director of the Alaska Blue Economy Center, who has written a paper for us titled Towards an Ocean-Centric Climate Adaptation in the Arctic. Justin, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate you taking the time, and we're looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Duncan. I chose to focus on a particular aspect of the climate mitigation strategies thus far, and namely that 1% of global climate finance is dedicated towards the oceans, despite them being the largest carbon sink and heat sink on the planet, and that we need to dramatically reassess that in order to address climate change. This is an ecosystem services approach. something that we've been rapidly developing our ability to model and understand and value. In 2011, there was an estimate that was put out at $120 trillion per year for the planet's ecosystem services to humans. Obviously, these valuations are subject to debate and they're not thought of as absolute, but they do kind of represent our ability to use science and understand what these services are providing and then value them. And in Alaska, this is particularly important. Alaska has more coastline than the rest of the United States combined, 1/3 of our nation's exclusive economic zone. And the state is home to the largest fisheries in the world, with approximately 2/3 of the nation's landings harvested off of the Alaskan coast. And with all due respect to Jason, we're working closely with the industry here to help them address some of their issues around sustainability. But Alaska does have some of the best fisheries management models in the world. They're not perfect. There are issues such as bycatch. And there's also technological solutions that we're looking at there as well that could dramatically reduce and improve the fisheries and energy use, as well as the bycatch issue. So we're keenly interested in that. It's very important for the Alaskan economy. And this includes many coastal communities, and many of which are predominantly Alaskan Native communities. Simultaneously to our understanding of ecosystem services, a lot of the work that's happening around computer science is rapidly changing the technologies that are in the ocean. So whereas previously automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and novel technologies like blockchain were viewed as too early stage or expensive for these industries to adopt, that is changing as the price is being brought down, and advances in Moore's law are making it possible for one person to do the job of what used to take an entire team of people. In the past 5 years, these innovations have really accelerated, and that's changing how we can approach these, both our understandings of ecosystem services and our ability to value them and transact in them. One of the ways that this is best demonstrated is through some of the work that's happening around valuing the ecosystem services for whales and understanding the impact that they're having on phytoplankton and krill. Initially, scientists didn't quite understand why krill populations would decline when whales were removed from an ecosystem due to overhunting, and because the predation of the krill would go away, so you would think the krill would proliferate. And what they found actually is there's a symbiotic relationship between the whales and the krill, having to do with whales disturbing the water column, distributing nutrients in the ocean, and then simultaneously, actually, the whale poop would actually fertilize the ocean as well. So that would cause these phytoplankton blooms in areas that would otherwise be considered sort of deserts in the ocean. And then that would then bring in the krill, which the whales would then eat. And there's a whole, that's a very simplistic version of it, but there's a whole sequence of events that happen around that also benefit fisheries as well, and other plants and animals in the ocean. And just for some context, phytoplankton, it's estimated to have produced 50% of the world's oxygen over time, and that they account for 30% of carbon sequestration on the planet. So they're basically equivalent to about 4 Amazon rainforests. At the same time, whale populations have declined from 5 million, seems to be about the carrying capacity of the Earth for large cetaceans, and we're down to 1 million. Initially, this was the result of overhunting, but today there's a significant issue with ship strikes in the transportation industry. So one of the things to address is that there's all this anthropogenic carbon within the ocean atmosphere system that's already been generated. And while we're focused pretty keenly on reducing the emissions that we're creating now and into the future, we also need to address this carbon that's already been built up. And there's a lot of technological solutions that are being proposed, but there's also unknowns with each of those. And so looking at natural systems where nature's already doing this, such as just letting the whales frolic in the ocean, would be considered and in our opinion, more beneficial than looking at technological solutions alone. And this is going to require an investment in our understanding of the oceans, namely inventorying these ecosystem services is going to require understanding what's there, cataloging what's in the oceans, how they work, and then assigning carbon values to them. And carbon value is just kind of the beginning step. It could go beyond carbon towards looking at biodiversity in the future, because there's significant evidence that there's potential cure for cancers or anti-aging drugs that could be found in the ocean. And in cold water climates, there seems to be a concentration of valuable plants and animals in the ocean that actually have unique characteristics to them, novel bioactive compounds that could be developed into some of these drugs. In addition to the large cetaceans, mangrove forests, seagrasses, and seaweeds all provide significant ecosystem services as well, and simultaneously are regenerative solutions to erosion and rising sea levels. Alaska is home to some of the world's largest kelp beds, and seaweed farming is an emerging industry that could dramatically expand the footprint for kelp ecosystems to the benefit of fisheries and marine ecosystem health. It requires no arable land, fresh water, fertilizer, and very little maintenance during the growth season. And studies have shown a localized reduction of ocean acidification as this crop absorbs carbon during its growth cycle. So scientists have been trying to understand how to take advantage of this carbon cycle that occurs with the seaweed farming, and I've been looking at sinking seaweed to the seafloor after harvest. But there's other studies that show a higher value add by actually utilizing the seaweed in particular ways. And one example would be looking at adding it to animal feed. Some of the species, kelp species that are readily found in Alaska have been shown to reduce methane emissions from livestock by as much as 80%. And that methane is also known to have a global warming potential footprint of 85 times that of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period, and has a significantly higher value on the carbon markets. The Biden administration recently pegged the price of carbon at $51 a ton versus $1,500 a ton for methane. So there's significant multiplier effect there by actually harvesting the seaweed and getting it into animal feed. It also has the additional benefit of making the animals healthier and better tasting. And seaweed's also an excellent fertilizer for agricultural crops. It's loaded with minerals, vitamins, and enzymes, including naturally occurring growth hormones that account for its rapid growth cycle. And the main limitation right now is that most of the seaweed in the United States is actually coming from hand-harvested seaweed, mostly off the coast of Maine and in Nova Scotia. But this seaweed could easily be grown in Alaska at much higher volumes and introduced into larger scale agricultural use. In that process, it actually brings important trace minerals back into our agricultural lands and into the food supply, improving the nutrient value of our food supply. And it's not necessarily just limited to agricultural crops. There's been a proposal here in Alaska looking at addressing the issue of methane trapped beneath the tundra in the permafrost. Is a significant climate risk. As the climate warms, that methane is being released into the atmosphere. And so there's been a proposal to study the impact of actually fertilizing the tundra to increase its depth and insulative properties during the warmer months of the year, so that it would actually prevent the permafrost from melting. The other issue is that large-scale seaweed farming could be co-located with offshore wind farms and adjacent to other renewable energy sources. Alaska has some of the largest renewable energy resources in the world, but they're largely stranded from energy use, meaning there's little to no electricity demand in the remote areas where the resources are. And processing the massive amounts of seaweed that could be grown co-located with these wind farms into biomass or food, feed or fertilizers or even biofuel is something that could be a use for that energy. The projects would also benefit from permitting synergies and shared infrastructure costs. So over time, carbon valuation, as I mentioned, could be expanded into these biodiversity applications. The mechanisms aren't there yet, but it's something that we could be studying and putting funds towards the research of. And since the Alaska Blue Economy Center is located within the University of Alaska Fairbanks, we're a research institution. We work with the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, as well as our renewable energy researchers and our business school. We're looking at ways to develop interdisciplinary solutions and research that could come out of it and then be engineered into industry-based solutions. So finally, I'll just note that Alaska is home to 229 federally recognized tribes and 40% of the total US tribal population. And in coastal regions of the state, the approximate population of Alaska Natives is 37%, according to the latest census data. There's over 200 native villages in Alaska that are affected to some degree by flooding and erosion made worse by climate change. And a significant number of communities depend on fishing for their livelihoods and subsistence to feed their families. These communities and cultures have stewarded the lands and oceans where they lived for thousands of years. And there's much to be learned from their traditional ecological knowledge. And market mechanisms should be derived to incentivize and fully compensate these communities for their stewardship. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin. A lot of very, very important points there, and fascinating to see how the applications can be made from sort of the blue economy onto traditional agriculture on land as well. I'd like a reminder for our audience: if you have questions, please send them to our Twitter account at Wilson Center GEP or our email gep@wilsoncenter.org. We have two presenters for our final paper, the co-authors of a fascinating paper titled "A Rising Tide Lifts All Boats: How Policymakers Can Summon the wave energy needed to enable the captains of blue economy businesses." That is by Nicole Baker and Sarah Aubrey, both from Net Your Problem. I think, Nicole, I'm going to go over to you first of all.
Yep, sounds great. Appreciate it, Duncan. Thanks for having us. Our background is a little bit different, I think, than the previous speakers. I have zero policy background, and Sarah doesn't either. We both have master's degrees in marine biology, and I started Net Your Problem a couple of years ago after working on commercial fishing vessels in Alaska as an observer. So the Alaska fisheries require scientists to be on board the vessels to document the bycatch and other issues of what the fishermen are catching, even their target species. And so that was how I sort of got involved with the blue economy without even knowing that that's what I was doing in the beginning. I really like Mike's definition of blue economy and what Jason mentioned too. That's the same one that we use, which is the World Bank definition. And we feel like fishing gear recycling, which is what Net Your Problem does, fits into the blue economy. It sort of straddles fisheries and waste management. So kind of two very disparate industries, I guess, that don't really, have a lot in common or work together a lot. And that's what we are trying to change. And so the paper that we wrote with this catchy title, I'm hoping, which makes people want to read it, was based on sort of our work over the past 4 years, trying to figure out how to have a alternative disposal option for fishing gear. Mike mentioned, that the 100% Fish project is trying to utilize, some of the waste in the actual fish products. And then we're trying to utilize the waste from the fishing gear and turn it into new things. And so one of the phrases that we use a lot at Net Your Problem is waste as a resource. So we try not to think about it as a waste because it is indeed a resource for another industry. It just needs a little bit of love and attention to transform it into something that can be used in another industry. And so what I wrote sort of in our executive summary and in the key recommendations were that I should say the reason that we need sort of different policies is because what we're doing is pretty challenging. The alternatives for disposal for gear at the end of its life right now are keeping it in a storage yard forever, which is actually a pretty popular strategy, taking it to the landfill or incinerating it. And all of those are pretty bad, just general wastes of petroleum resources, which we know that extracting petroleum contributes to climate change. And so we want to make use of as much of the petroleum resources many, many times over as we possibly can. And so when we first started this in Dutch Harbor in Alaska, there were not a lot of barriers to what we were doing. A lot of the businesses that fish in Dutch Harbor are very commercial, very profitable, and it wasn't that difficult to charge them for collection of the gear. We had service providers there that could load containers, and then we sent them to our recycling partners in Europe. So this is about sort of Europe-US collaboration in the blue economy, and we are, implementing that by utilizing these recycling facilities in Europe. And so originally it wasn't that difficult, only when we started expanding within Alaska and then also throughout the US. So I'm talking to you from New York, but I normally live in Seattle, and that's where I'm in charge of the Seattle, Alaska stuff. Sarah is in Southern California, and then we have two other employees that are in Maine, where Mike is at. We're actually members of the New England Ocean Cluster, and then also in Massachusetts. And so we're trying to expand our model to collect gear from these other locations. And we've come across a variety of different challenges, some of which have policy solutions and some of which don't. And so basically the recommendations that we make in the report are to develop the infrastructure and capacity of domestic recycling programs. So there are a lot of regulations that govern the global export and trade of plastic waste that can make it very difficult and expensive to do, which obviously increases the cost to the fishermen and other entities paying for this. But I think this is a solution that can help not just the blue economy or the fishing industry. This can also help, general waste management. So I think a lot of people are familiar a couple of years ago where China decided that they weren't accepting people's plastic garbage anymore, and everybody's like, what are we going to do? So we really need to be dealing with our waste at home generally. And then if we do that, that also will enable our business. One of the other recommendations that we make is to protect our ocean resources through a focus on the prevention of plastic pollution. So I think it's really sexy when people are like, doing beach cleanups and taking pictures, and ocean cleanup is like taking a couple tons of stuff out of the ocean. But in reality, it is really expensive, difficult, ineffective, and challenging to collect gear once it's made it into the ocean. And so I think we really need to shift our focus to preventing plastic pollution, even though it's not as flashy and taking great pictures and putting it in press releases. That if we do prevention of pollution, which is basically having good waste management systems, then that reduces or eliminates the possibility of this stuff getting into the terrestrial or the marine environment. One of the other recommendations that we make is to encourage the demand for recycled plastic. And so I can collect all the plastic I want, send it to Europe, they can make all the plastic pellets they want. If nobody purchases that plastic for use in manufacturing, my work is useless. So we really need to make sure that the demand for the recycled plastic is there. I think this is coming a lot through consumer pressure. Consumers saying, I don't want stuff made out of virgin plastic. I want stuff made out of recycled plastic. But in order to sort of really jumpstart this, I think some regulations about recycled content mandates could be especially useful. And we're seeing these, but not in, I'm calling it non-single use plastic. So I think a lot of the focus of the plastics discussion in general is about single-use plastics, but a lot of plastic is used in not single-use plastics. And in fact, a majority is. So 2/3 of plastic is used in a not single-use application. And so if we're encouraging demand for recycled plastic in manufacturing in these industries, which can incorporate that plastic and last a long time I think that can really move the whole recycling system forward. And then as a tangentially related thing too, we want to discourage the use of virgin plastic, which is just made from oil. And so when we were writing this policy brief, actually, I did some research on subsidies that are given to the oil extraction industry, and the number made my head spin, something like $20 billion a year. And I just think, what could we as a business do with even 0.0001% of that 20 billion? And so we as a society need to decide sort of what our priorities are, what we want to focus our government investments on. And we don't believe that subsidizing oil is good for the people, the planet. And so we want to be shifting those government investments towards other industries. And so once we incorporate all of these recommendations, the benefits for this are lowering greenhouse gas emissions, which I feel like every country is trying to work on solutions to that right now, decreasing the amount of space needed for landfills. And so this is, acutely a problem in Alaska. A lot of the tribal nations that Justin mentioned, and even some of the island communities, just don't have the room. So I think, in the lower 48, we've got plenty of space. We can just fill it all up with garbage, but that's not the solution everywhere. And so we really want to be decreasing the amount of space that we take up for landfills, and also just wasting those resources. And if we have domestic recycling programs, I think you see in the news all the time too, supply chain problems, this, that, and the other thing, ports are clogged, can't get my containers unloaded. So if we can do sort of the collection and the processing and the manufacturing of all of this stuff within the United States, that is going to lower costs and just generally make our supply chain work more efficiently, while at the same time sort of reducing the possibility of pollution, conserving petroleum resources, saving energy, and creating jobs. And that's what the blue economy is all about, creating jobs that are related to sustainable use of our ocean resources. So I think I will stop there and give us some time for questions. Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks, Nicole. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add to Nicole's excellent presentation?
No, that was excellent. I'm happy to save time for questions.
Perfect. Thank you both very, very much. The first thing that I wanted to say as moderator of this session is that extraordinary diversity amongst these papers. I very much enjoyed reading all of them, taking different approaches, but obviously united by the focus on the blue economy. I did detect some differences in the definition, the exact or precise definition of what the blue economy is. But this factor of sustainability comes back time and time again. And so, feel free to comment on that when you answer the specific question I'm going to give you right now, which is something which hits home very much for us at the Wilson Center. We have a challenge. Obviously, our entire purpose is to actually have an impact on public policy. Very often, though, we find ourselves falling into echo chambers where we're speaking to people who naturally agree with us, and we're not actually changing anybody's mind. A number of you in your papers talked about the need for outreach to stakeholders, to local communities, to policymakers, etc. Nicole, you just talked about the Instagrammable image of collecting waste on a beach. That's fantastic, but that's not really what we want to see. I'm thinking here about how do we create narratives, how do we create the stories that will really get out there to impact policymakers, to impact the people who are on the front lines of the blue economy. And perhaps, I could begin, in the order of play that we had. Mike, any thoughts that you might have on that? How do we get beyond just the folks who already agree with us?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we sort of constantly struggle with, I think, in the ocean community. I give you one example. We're preparing to host Aspen Ideas Climate through the Aspen Institute in March in Miami Beach. And one of my roles at the Aspen Institute is to try to, working with the Energy and Environment Program, is to get the ocean more integrated into even the climate conversation. I mean, I think Justin brought this up, but so little of the resources that go into climate action are focused on the ocean, even though it covers, over 2/3 of the planet and, represents such a massive force in both climate impacts as well as potentially climate opportunities. So, we do need to do a better job as an ocean community of carrying our message to other places. So, thinking about the Aspen Ideas Climate event, for an example, 4 days of panels and discussions, I'm trying to the best that I possibly can to put ocean people into panels that are not ocean focused. So just in that one small example of, it's not ivory towers, it's not academia, but the sort of cloistered world a little bit of what goes on in the Aspen Institute's audience, expanding minds and getting people to think about the ocean for the sake of the planet, as opposed to the ocean for the sake of the ocean as something that's distinct and different. And that's what I really like about the cluster model as well. And I think, the work that Nicole and Sarah are doing are very much part of this. As people start to think about a problem like plastic, that's an entry point to then talk about how the ocean is impacting daily lives in other places. But it's a perpetual problem to try to crack. Is how do you get somebody who lives 1,000 miles from the nearest beach to worry about what's going on in the ocean? It's an out of sight, out of mind problem. And so these stories of success, whether they be that is the value of the Instagrammable image of a beach cleanup. It doesn't solve the problem. You're absolutely right, Nicole, but it does raise awareness, and it reminds people that these other possibilities exist. And I know you're not saying or I assume you're not saying it's valueless, and I think that's that's a piece of it. But we do need to balance when we think about limited resources, where we're applying these things and how we grow the whole pie of resources to get these messages out there. It's something I've been struggling with for basically the entirety of my policy career is how to get people to pay more attention to the ocean. So still working on that. But I think these partnerships that we develop and the bringing in new industries and new innovations that are in and of themselves great stories are part of that process.
Thanks, Mike. Jason, over to you.
Yeah, actually, fortunately, in this space that I'm talking about, this is not a problem at all. Getting people interested is not a problem at all. And in fact, I'm, talking from the U.S. context, it won't be a shock to many of the audience and you all that Republicans are not leading the way for ocean conservation. But they're really big on this innovation stuff and on the cultivated seafood. And why is that? A, it will help the U.S. trade balance because most of our seafood is imported. B, it's jobs in America. It's economic growth in America. It puts America at the head of innovation. So the point being here is this new blue economy seafood sector, I think it's really imperative. It's not, the irony here, it's not the usual suspects that we're talking about are just all in agreement and can't get other people. It's that the usual suspects, the NGO communities, everything, they're not aware about it. They're focused on maximum sustainable yield in the ocean. They're not paying attention to finless foods and blue nalu. And so in fact, it's the reverse problem. So I'm trying as an insider to get the NGO community, to get the policy community to say there's incredible technological innovation going here. And this is a big part of it. And let's get some money and some policy, energy focused on this. And again, other countries are ahead of us right now. Singapore, Israel, places in the EU, but I think the US is catching up and this is going to be a bipartisan push.
Thanks, Jason. We're going to come back to that question of technology and innovation in a second, but let me go over to Justin next.
There is a lot of bipartisanship. Alaska has 2 Republican senators that are doing quite a lot for the ocean economy, the blue economy, as it could be defined. And we work very closely with them. They've been very receptive to our requests, whether that's looking at funding for ocean clusters or research or issues such as ocean plastic. And you could even say they're potentially leading the way on that nationally. So, we look for bipartisan solutions where we can find them. We think that's very important. I think this issue around the 1% of climate finance going into the oceans is just a massive misallocation and a huge mistake from people trying to address the issue. So I think that therein lies the biggest problem. And to the extent that we can find solutions to draw more funding in towards market mechanisms that can address these disparities, the better.
Thanks so much, Justin. Nicole and Sarah?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I love the story about how Nicole started Net Your Problem, right? She was working in Alaska and she saw a problem and she figured out a way to solve it. And connecting people to what's going on is really the most important part about getting them to care about it, right? And we're in this really amazing time where we've got so much mobility, so much potential for connection. And I think that if we're able to figure out what is the language to identify these shared values, I think all of that stuff and incorporating that into our stories will help give us momentum, especially when we're here talking about the solutions. You know, a lot of people, I think, will be refreshed. You know, there's all kinds of solutions that everyone presented today, and it keeps everyone's ears open and excitement going. And oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe what I heard today, you know, word of mouth and telling people that you know. And I think that's all what's going to move us forward.
Thanks, Sarah. Nicole, anything you would like to add there?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was going to say too, is just that this sort of like one-on-one connection, I think that we are making with fishermen, you know, gets them aware of and excited about, maybe not excited, but at least tolerant of the idea of doing something different. And so it's just about, yeah, making relationships, sort of like the whole cluster thing, making relationships and, you know, doing the hard work, I guess, of having one-on-one conversations. I don't think any like mass email mailing or blog or whatever is what's going to change people's minds or get them interested in topics. It's about building authentic relationships.
Thank you. So I want to take one question from the audience that has come in. And as I hinted just now, it's about technology innovation. So here's a very simple question that requires a very quick answer from each of you. What would you say is the most important and/or most exciting technological innovation that's going to help us to achieve a truly sustainable blue economy? Let's go in reverse order, just to put Nicole right on this spot right now.
Well, this is easy for us. That's recycling, you know, machines to shred and recycle stuff here in the US, because I think that is a circular economy solution in the true sense of that. Waste and putting it back into manufacturing.
Thank you. Sarah, I see you nodding. I'm guessing you agree with Nicole. Yes, good. Okay, Justin?
I really think seaweed farming has the greatest potential. When you look at its ability to sequester carbon, provide jobs, clean the ocean, provide these ecosystem services, it's very impressive, and I think it has a tremendous future in front of it.
Thanks, Justin. I also want to give a shout out to a point that you make in the paper about blockchain technology, which really increases transparency in the industry. Jason.
Yeah, so I love Justin's point about the seaweed, but I'm going to trump that, I think, with the cultivated seafood. I think that is hands down the most promising technology for really radical change, but love the seaweed too.
Thanks. And lastly, Mike.
Yeah, mine's a little bit of a cop-out, I think, because I don't have a specific technology in mind, but for me, it's about ocean observation and the use of big data and artificial intelligence gathering to pull together a greater understanding of what the ocean is, what's happening in it, what lives there, and setting our baselines and being able to measure from there to understand the changes that we're making. So it's about data gathering and observation opportunities.
I'd like to thank all of our panelists. It's been a very dynamic and interactive session today. Thank you all for your contributions today, but more importantly, the papers that you wrote for us. As I said earlier on, the papers will be coming out next week. I'm delighted in my interim role as director of the Global Europe Program to be associated with this publication. It makes a real contribution to the conversation here in Washington and hopefully across the Atlantic in Europe as well. A special word of thanks again to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their support of the Global Europe Program, and in particular our Blue Economy Initiative. Huge shout out, however, to Jason Moyer, who pulled everything together on this. Jason, you're not appearing actually on the live webcast of this, but you'll hear on the call. Thank you very much for everything you do for the Global Europe Program. You're a real credit to us. And please stay tuned to the Wilson Center and to the Global Europe Program for more programming on these issues. Have a great day, everybody.